On a chilly January night in 2003, in a quiet suburb of Houston, Texas, a shocking crime took place that would grip the nation. It was the story of a young mother, Susan Wright, who, in the eyes of many, lived an ordinary life with her husband, Jeff, and their two small children. They had a modest house, an American dream of sorts, painted with the warmth of a budding family. To outsiders, they appeared happy enough. But like many tales that hide dark secrets behind closed doors, the Wrights' life was not what it seemed. Susan was a petite woman with a soft, innocent face, often described as gentle and introverted. She married Jeff Wright in 1998, a man who seemed to complete her life in every way. He was charismatic, with a magnetic smile, known for his lively personality. However, beneath the surface of their marriage, a storm was brewing. What started as a love story would descend into accusations of abuse, betrayal, and eventually, a brutal murder. In the weeks that followed the murder, the media would be flooded with images of Susan, a young mother turned murder suspect. What led this seemingly shy and mild-mannered woman to kill her husband in such a violent manner? What could possibly drive her to stab him a chilling 193 times? This story of love, fear, and a desperate act for survival was, for some, a clear-cut case of self-defense against an abusive husband. For others, it was the ultimate betrayal, a crime so gruesome that it seemed almost inconceivable. But as the investigation began to uncover the details, it became clear that the truth was more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Susan Lucille Wyke was born in 1976, growing up in a family that often moved around, which made her a bit of a loner. Known for her shy demeanor, Susan's early years were marked by a quiet resilience and a desire to create a stable, loving home, something she perhaps never fully had. This longing for security led her to Jeff Wright, a charismatic man she met in the late 1990s. Jeff was full of life, captivating her with his charm and confidence. They married in 1998, and before long, they had their first child, Bradley. The early days of their marriage were promising. Jeff was supportive, and Susan felt a sense of stability she'd craved for years. They moved into a quaint home in Houston, where they aimed to build a future together. But as time went on, the fairy tale began to unravel. Jeff started to display signs of aggression, and according to Susan, he began to drink heavily. She claimed that his temper flared easily, often taking out his frustrations on her, both verbally and physically. Family members and friends, however, painted a different picture. While some mentioned seeing signs of tension between the couple, they believed Jeff was a loving father and husband. No one could have predicted the dark turn their relationship would take. With two small children to care for, Susan felt trapped. She feared for her safety, she claimed, but worried more about the future of her children. She thought about leaving, but with little financial independence, she felt her options were limited. Her love for Jeff, or perhaps the hope that he might change, held her back from walking away entirely. These conflicting feelings pulled her in opposite directions, keeping her in a marriage that was steadily eroding her sense of self. But then, on January 13, 2003, everything changed. That night would set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter Susan's life and take Jeff's. It was an ordinary evening on January 13, 2003, in the Wright household. The children were tucked into bed, and the house was finally quiet. According to Susan, Jeff had been irritable that day, having returned home in a sour mood. He was restless, she said, pacing around the house with a drink in his hand, his eyes glazed over. Susan claimed that Jeff had been drinking heavily, and that each glass he drained seemed to fuel an anger simmering beneath the surface. What happened next would be contested in court, but according to Susan's account, an argument erupted. She later testified that Jeff had begun shouting at her, accusations flying that made her feel cornered and terrified. She claimed he lashed out physically, and she was certain he was going to hurt her badly this time. It was a feeling she knew too well. But something in her snapped. This night would be different. Susan later said that her mind went blank as she decided she had to defend herself. With trembling hands, Susan made her way to the kitchen, where she grabbed a knife. When she returned, her fear turned to desperation. She claimed Jeff lunged at her, but she was ready. She fought back, stabbing him with a surge of panic and survival. Over and over, the blade plunged, each movement quick, fueled by a flood of pent-up rage and fear. When it was over, Jeff was still, his body lying on the bed, lifeless. In a shocking and visceral detail, Susan had stabbed her husband 193 times. The sheer number of wounds stunned investigators later and became one of the most controversial aspects of her story. This wasn't just self-defense, they argued. This was overkill. The wounds weren't just confined to his torso or heart, they were on his face, neck, and even on his hands, as if Jeff had tried to shield himself. Once Jeff lay motionless, Susan was left with the aftermath. The initial shock of what she'd done slowly faded into a cold reality. She was a mother with 2 young children sleeping just down the hall, a woman who had just killed her husband in a horrific scene of blood and violence. She tried to clean up, wiping down surfaces, and she even attempted to drag Jeff's body to the backyard to bury it, but her plans fell apart. Hours later, Susan wrapped Jeff's body in a rug and placed it in a shallow grave in the backyard, hoping to conceal her actions just long enough to figure out what to do next. Exhausted and shaken, Susan retreated into silence, hoping somehow she could maintain an illusion of normalcy. But the reality of Jeff's absence would inevitably come to light. The day after the murder, Susan went about her life as if nothing was amiss. She attended to her children, cooked meals, and tried to carry on with her routine. But it wasn't long before people noticed Jeff was missing. When friends and family reached out, she offered vague excuses, claiming that he'd simply gone away for a while. But the absence of any direct communication from Jeff raised suspicions among those closest to him. Susan began to feel the pressure mount. On January 18th, just 5 days after the murder, she made a fateful decision. She went to her attorney and confessed everything, albeit framed within the narrative of self-defense. She claimed that Jeff had abused her for years, that she'd been terrified of him, and that the attack had been her only means of survival. The police were immediately notified, and Susan led them to Jeff's shallow grave in the backyard. The crime scene was as gruesome as it was chilling. The authorities were struck not only by the horrific nature of Jeff's wounds, but also by the circumstances in which his body had been buried. This wasn't the work of a desperate, battered wife defending herself, they argued. To them, it looked premeditated, calculated. The brutality of the murder quickly became the talk of Houston, and media outlets across the country seized upon the story. Detectives who interviewed Susan were struck by her calm demeanor as she recounted the events. Some interpreted her composure as stoic, while others saw it as evidence of cold-hearted calculation. The question loomed, could someone so seemingly mild-mannered really commit such a brutal act in self-defense? Susan's trial became one of the most sensationalized cases in Texas. The prosecution portrayed her as a manipulative, cold-blooded killer, emphasizing the excessive nature of the wounds Jeff had sustained. They argued that her actions went far beyond self-defense. The image of Susan stabbing Jeff repeatedly was painted as a gruesome tableau of rage and premeditation. The trial reached a dramatic peak when the prosecutor, Kelly Siegler, brought a bed into the courtroom and used it to reenact the murder in front of the jury. In a shocking demonstration, she straddled the bed, replicating the position Susan would have been in as she stabbed Jeff. Siegler's performance was meant to make a lasting impact on the jury, to show them just how personal and intense the attack had been. Siegler argued that this was not a crime of passion in a single frantic moment, but a sustained attack that showed determination and malice. Susan's defense, however, painted a drastically different picture. Her attorneys argued that she had been a victim of ongoing abuse, claiming that Jeff's behavior had been both physically and emotionally harmful. They brought in witnesses who described Jeff as volatile and Susan as submissive, painting a narrative of a woman trapped in a toxic relationship with no way out. Her lawyers emphasized that Susan had been in survival mode, with years of fear culminating in that single night. Susan herself took the stand, recounting the years of torment she claimed to have endured. She spoke of nights filled with fear, a feeling like a prisoner in her own home. Her testimony moved some to see her as a victim, someone who had reached her breaking point. But for others, the brutal details of the crime overshadowed any sympathy her story might have garnered. In the end, the jury convicted Susan Wright of murder. The excessive violence of her attack weighed heavily in their decision, leading them to reject her self-defense plea. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. For many who followed the trial, the verdict seemed just, aligning with the narrative of a calculated murder driven by rage rather than self-preservation. However, not everyone agreed with the harsh sentence. Over time, Susan's case gained support from advocates who believed she had indeed acted out of desperation. The media continued to cover her story, debating the fairness of her sentence and the blurred line between victim and perpetrator. Years later, Susan appealed her case, and in 2010 her sentence was reduced to 20 years. The case continued to spark debates about domestic violence, mental health, and the justice system's treatment of women who commit violent crimes. Some saw her reduced sentence as a step toward justice, while others remained skeptical, feeling the horror of Jeff's murder deserved the original punishment. Susan Wright's case remains one of the most notorious in Texas history, a haunting reminder of how quickly love can turn to terror, and how even the quietest lives can conceal dark secrets. For those who knew the Wrights, the events of that January night left a scar that would never fully heal.